Hello and good evening. Nice to have you all with us here at Wissenschaft, fürs, Wohnzimmer, Sitting Room Science, at today's English-speaking episode with our dear fellow colleague, Bimo. We'll talk a bit about his experience there at the COP27. Wissenschaft, fürs, Wohnzimmer, Sitting Room Science is presented to you by the Avis for Future, that is the Future group here of employees of the Alfred-Wegener-Institute for Polar and Marine Research. I'm Bjorn Suko. I work at the bioeconomy section, try to make the food of the future as sustainable as possible, and therefore I turn my view towards the ocean. And I'm not here alone, but with two more colleagues that will present themselves right now.
Yeah, good evening, everyone. I am Rebecca. I'm also a scientist at the Alfred-Wegener-Institute. And I also study the ocean, so I'm a physical oceanographer, which means that I look at the tides and the way that the oceans change over time and how that affects our climate. So I particularly focused in the Arctic and looking at the sea level rise and the warming of the oceans in the Arctic Ocean. And we're very lucky to have Bimo here this evening, who will present his experience at COP27. And if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. That can be done in English or in German, of course, and we will relay them to Bimo, and he will answer them at the end. And so looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions. And on to Nathan.
Yeah, hello, my name is Nathan. I work in the climate dynamics section at AVI, so it's a little bit like physical oceanography, except we mainly use models rather than observations. So I do a bit of climate modeling, bit of ocean modeling. And I'm looking forward to it as well. Before we begin though, it's a good time to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you can see all of our future great presentations. And Bimo.
Hi, moin, salut, namaste everybody. I'm Bimo. I'm also a climate scientist at Alfred-Wegener-Institute. I'm mostly working with sea ice, looking at observations and model forecast, trying to understand how good they are. I'm very happy to be here today. Thank you guys for giving me the opportunity. And I was lucky to be at COP27 this year. So I'm here to give you some impressions from my time at COP. And what I saw, how I felt, and how it all went for me. So COP stands for Conference of Parties, but I feel like Conference of Parties was not enough of a description. So I said, okay, it's like a circus, it's like a collaboration. There's a bit of a confusion, but eventually it was more like a competition of parties, because all these different parties that were present at COP, both the countries and also the different organizations, all the people, they were sort of competing with each other, both in terms of what they want the result of COP to be, but also what they want to present to the people. So yeah, but let's go back a little bit. Where was COP? COP was in Sharm El-Sheikh, which is at the bottom of the Sinai Peninsula in Egypt. Kind of an interesting place. It's like this dry desert landscape right next to the Red Sea, which is like full of these dry mountains right outside of the city. But it's actually now mostly known as a resort town. So a lot of tourism industries going on there. But Egypt obviously transformed the whole thing and built a bunch of venues and new roads and everything to invite people for COP. So to go back a little bit, COP, Conference of Parties, is organized by the UNFCCC, which is this United Nations body that is responsible for dealing in action about climate change. And there are all these member parties. So this term is very important in this context. That's why it's called Conference of Parties, because these are all the countries that are party to this convention. And it also allows for the presence of civil society observers. So that's what my role there was. Here's a little badge and it says observer here. So alongside the formal negotiation, the different organizations or also countries or different bodies such as EU or whatever you have, like the WHO, they all also set up these little pavilions, and these pavilions, obviously, in this case, it's related to climate, right? So actually, my role there was actually a volunteer at the Cryosphere Pavilion. The Cryosphere Pavilion is set up by this organization called the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. It's a very small organization, kind of based between Sweden and the US, which essentially wants to bring the cryospheric issues to the forefront of the climate discussion, because obviously it's very important. When the glaciers are melting, it's not just going to affect people living next to the glaciers, but the whole world as the sea level rises. That's why cryosphere is very important. The pavilion looked something like this. They had all these little totems, they were called, set up, which are showing the different pillars of the cryosphere, whether it's polar ocean or ice sheets, glaciers, permafrost. And on these different sides, there are like descriptions showing what is going to happen to this particular pillar of the cryosphere under different emission scenario. All of this information, by the way, is also available in the State of the Cryosphere report, which actually came out during COP, and it summarizes all latest scientific findings. One of the sad and important thing it kind of highlights is about Arctic sea ice. So you see this totem has kind of fallen to the ground. It's essentially showing that our climate situation is so bad that we're most definitely going to have a ice-free summer in the Arctic at this point. That is definitely going to happen, no matter what we do. So yeah, I was here as part of this pavilion to kind of, as an early career scientist, to kind of guide people through this information, also to share my work a little bit. Here I am obviously talking about Arctic sea ice and my research, also to be present in some panels, in discussions regarding what is my perspective as an early career scientist, and to meet some people and socialize and network a little bit. This woman on the right is the founder of the International Cryosphere Climate Initiative. The guy in the center is the Prince of Monaco. But I was not just here for the photo op. I was also here to learn a little bit about the negotiation. So I sat in on some discussions, some formal meetings between the parties. So this is the actual purpose of COP, to have formal meeting between the parties of the convention to discuss and figure out, negotiate what action we can take, what legally binding action we can take. So you'll see a little bit more about this, some more scenes from the little pavilions around the COP, and also some scenes from these meetings in the video, which will be released at 9:15 today, I think, on the YouTube channel for Avis for Future. But just to give you a little bit of, my view, like I sat in on a couple of these meetings and I honestly got quite disappointed, because it was like an hour discussion about how to change words in a document, because a lot of these discussions where they were legally binding in one way or another. So countries were very motivated to make sure that either the discussion does not move forward, or the discussion is hampered enough to remove the parts that are being more problematic. So this was kind of depressing, to be honest. So after a few rounds of this, I said, okay, I'm not gonna go in there, because this is not giving me anything as a motivational factor. It was instead more motivational to sit outside and like talk to people about the science. So here there was like a poster day session going on for Earth Information Day, or just to actually walk in the pavilion and answer people's questions, because that's what I know. I know the science. I can answer people's scientific question. I cannot tell people how to convince countries who do not want to give up their emissions. So like I said, there was a lot of action at the pavilions. A lot of countries had their own pavilions. A lot of rich countries had really nice, fancy, big pavilions. A lot of poor countries had a little table on the side. And that's another factor that was very not satisfying for me. well, okay, I'm not talking particularly about Germany, but Germany had a nice pavilion as well, and there was a lot of discussions there. And actually, the cool thing about the German pavilion was that there were some scientists present that people could go and talk to. Yeah, here's some other pavilion examples. The children and youth pavilion was very famous because all the young people were actually very passionate, and they were singing and like dancing and talking about things with a lot of passion. A lot of people in the Pacific Pavilion were also very passionate because these were low-lying countries, island nations, and for them, climate change is right out on their doorstep. So they can actually see the land getting taken away by the ocean. So some pavilions were definitely more important and more powerful than others. Some other pavilions were by these big countries, which are oil nations, and they were just there, nothing actually going on. Also, a lot of activism. There were different kinds of activism going on. There was this interesting thing called the Fossil of the Day Award, which showed which country is acting like a fossil and not doing actual climate action, but being stuck in their own process. There was this discussion about how past negotiations have been full of dirty details, unclear processes, or mostly loans, and basically kind of highlighting the shortcomings of previous negotiation. There was this interesting little art display about the flood is coming, so showing this symbolic flooding process. The flood is coming, basically. Sea level is going up, the flood is coming. A lot of buzz around famous people coming in and out of the conference. It was quite a busy time. I managed to take like one morning off for 1 hour to go swim in the ocean. That was my vacation there in the entire week of me being there. So I think the interesting thing is what was the result from the COP27 negotiation. So what was actually agreed upon, and what's the limiting factor? What's the catch that's actually part of the discussion? So the main topic of discussion during this COP was this loss and damage fund. So saying like what kind of loss and damage is already being caused by climate change or will be caused in the near future. Case in point, Pakistan, you might have all heard about it. 1/3 of Pakistan was flooded this year. So they were feeling this climate change quite really, quite intensely. So Pakistan was actually a leader in this kind of discussion, but also other countries, island nations especially, are very active on this. So there was an agreement to establish a dedicated fund for vulnerable countries and to give more technical assistance to developing countries, especially those that are vulnerable to various effects of climate change. This also kind of incentivizes industrial nations to limit greenhouse emission, because there's like this idea that, okay, if you're making more greenhouse emission, then this will create more loss and damage in the future, so you will have to pay more. So this is the circular logic upon which this is based. However, exact money value has not been agreed. This is just an agreement to establish this fund, which took 2 weeks of discussion. So, I can see Bjorn raising his eyebrows, and that's exactly how I feel about this whole thing. Another thing that was discussed quite heavily was mitigation, obviously. There was a new mitigation work program launched, and there was this request for governments to improve and go back and revise their national climate plan, to phase down coal power and to phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. But this is, again, what I was talking about. There was the previous draft actually said phase out coal power and phase out fossil fuels, but then repeated negotiations kind of was like, okay, people don't want to agree to this. And then so over and over, it went on until people agreed that, okay, at least say phase down coal power and phase out inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. So this is, it sounds like just, legal lingo to us, but actually makes a difference in how rules are made later on. So it's kind of disappointing. I think I didn't mention this earlier, but COP27 was 2 weeks long. I was actually only there for the first week, but at the end of 2 weeks, there's this expectation that there's going to be the discussion, and then the negotiated result. It actually went 2 extra days because people were in so much disagreement about what the final text should be. So while discussions and negotiations are going on one side, the other side, they're actually like breaking apart the buildings and taking down the whole thing. So in the end, people kind of just give up. They're like, all right, we accept this. So a lot of dissatisfaction, especially from the EU or people from countries that are more forward in climate action regarding this. There was also like an asking for investment into renewable energy in the terms of $4 trillion per year, with the hope of reaching net zero by 2050. And the other thing that was kind of talked about a lot was this prior commitment to 1.5 degrees target, which is no improvement from previous plans or previous discussion. It's not a stronger ambition. But in the end, we were very happy that this kind of came out, because a lot of people there were talking about, 1.5 degrees, we're never going to make it. So let's just forget about it. Let's just move on to 2 degrees now, which, I don't want to say anything about it. At least it did not get worse. That's all I want to say. So and some other points that were discussed was promoting climate technology solutions in developing countries. There was a provision to boost low emission energy, which is left kind of vague. So it could mean gas, but it could also mean something else. There was a lot of recognition this year about health impacts of climate change. So now there's this awareness that there's a right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. So the climate does impact health. And for the first time, there is a lot of emphasis on tipping points and feedback loops, saying that, okay, if we don't do things, it will actually get worse. So this is a very important point. And also some recognition of scientific findings, while at the same time calling to further address systematic observation gaps. So I was part of the Cryosphere Pavilion, like I said, and on their part, their achievement was they brought together 18 governments led by Chile and Iceland to form this high-level group called Ambition on Melting Ice, or AMI. And this group essentially put forward a lot of cryospheric issues and tried to highlight this in the discussion, as a result of which the use of cryosphere was mentioned quite heavily in the final text from the negotiations. So to conclude, COP27 was a very educational and enriching experience for me. But in terms of climate action, the result was quite lacking. There was a lot of advertising and greenwashing from the different nations. One point I did not mention, and I don't know how deep I should go into it, was this presence of fossil fuel lobbyists that were actually part of different countries' delegates. So I think I kind of showed this in the beginning. I have this pass that says observer here, right? So that means I only get access to certain parts of the venue, which are observer open. A lot of people showed up with passes that says party, which means they're representatives from the country. But then I got to talk to them and I asked them, what are you actually doing? And they're like, I work in whatever, fossil fuel industry of some kind or another. So it was really shocking that countries were bringing people who are actively involved in greenhouse emission to be a part of this climate negotiation. So there was a lot of lobbying going on in this avenue. A lot of disappointment, but at the same time, any progress is better than no progress. So this avenue of discussion is still necessary. And in the end, I realized that change comes primarily from people putting pressure. So we need to maintain pressure on the governments around the world. So it was very short, I'm sorry, but I'm very happy to answer any questions. And you can also reach me in my social media. And thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Bimo. Great. This is all about you guys getting an impression on how these meetings are working. And with Bimo, we have somebody here who's actually able to answer a few questions on that on the long run. So this is a bit less scientific, but a bit more fun for you, we hope. So I hope you're seeing now what I'm seeing, that is the announcement of next week's next week's talk that is on the Polarstern. So our very famous and popular ice-breaking research vessel Polarstern is turning 40 years, and we're going to celebrate that here at AVI. And we will also have actually Ingo Scheel with us, who is coordinating the Polarstern activities and actions, and he will talk a bit in detail about some of the more interesting stories of 40 years of polar research using the Polarstern. As you can see by the title, this will be German-speaking episode. Right, that's enough for next week. The question would be this, Rebecca, is there any question in the chat?
So we do have questions in the chat. Before we go to those, I just want to add in really quickly that Bimo did some live streams from COP on our Instagram channel. And you can still check those out in our stories. So it's Avi's for Future with the number 4 in there. So you should give us a follow and check those out if you want. On to the questions. The first one is, do the actions of all the people at the COP and in the pavilions are actually being seen by the decision makers?
Yeah, so actually, they are being seen by the decision makers, and that was the cool part. Was actually I was getting to meet a lot of people who are actively involved in the negotiation. They came through the pavilions. That's also the point of the pavilion in some level, is to actually talk to them, show them the science. So some of these governments, in regards to this AMI committee that I mentioned, actually got to talk to them and convince them to be a part of this big high-level group. So a lot of the delegation member actually do go through there. Some of the pavilions don't get seen so much, or some of the displays don't get seen so much. So some of them is just for advertisement. So yes.
Yeah, Bimo, thank you for such an interesting insight into the COP itself. I mean, we've all heard so much, but only abstractly, sort of from the media. So it's interesting to see some of the smaller details which are left out. And it's great. We've had loads of questions in the chat, actually. And so Chloe has asked a really good question, and one that I'm asked as an Arctic researcher all the time and don't have an answer to. So if you do, Bimo, that would be great. And so she has asked, how did participating in this event actually influence the way you think about your job as a scientific researcher and about the future itself?
That is a really good question, and kind of difficult to answer as well, because on one hand, the way that this negotiation was taking place kind of made me feel a little bit depressed, being like, okay, the result is we're not moving forward. But at the same time, I shouldn't be so dismissive of this, because while this particular COP might not have made such huge impact, prior COPs have made some difference. And speaking as a scientist, as a researcher, the science is essentially what leads to all these discussions. So it does, yeah. So I think I kind of answered that in a back and forth way, but we do have a lot of value as scientists and as researchers, even if sometimes there can be a bit of setback.
All right, next question by Zebra Twist, or Zebra Twist, because I think it's a German-speaking person. Do you have the feeling that politics are indeed interested in science?
Yes, actually, I think politicians are definitely interested in science. I think depending on which country the politicians are from, then they're interested in science in different ways. So even there, I could see that oil nations, they were clearly trying to remove references to certain scientific documents, because they know that the science there is clearly showing the effects of greenhouse emissions. So they were clearly trying to remove this part from the discussion for whatever reason that is. So they're definitely interested in science. A lot of countries that are, especially those in low-lying areas or those that are suffering from, I forgot the technical term, I think they're called most vulnerable countries or something. They're definitely very interested in the science because they want to know what's going to happen to them, developing countries do not have as much modeling resources as Germany does, for example. And so people are interested in science from different perspectives, but they're definitely interested.
It's really interesting to see the sort of inside look at that. It's really cool. So feel free to still put questions in the chat and we will get to them. But I also have a question for you, Bimo. You mentioned that you got to talk to some people and do some networking and answer some questions. And my question is, what kind of people were those? I mean, I don't imagine you got to speak to the president of any country, or maybe one you put, was it Monaco? But anyway, the question is, who were they that you were talking to? What sort of impact did that?
Yeah, that's a good question, actually. Yeah, that was the Prince of Monaco. He was kind of just interested because I think his foundation sponsors the different things at the conference. So he was just kind of passing through, checking all them out. But I did get to meet a lot of people from here and there. So I met, for example, a senator from the US who was interested in, for example, a very specific question. He's like, how much methane is getting emitted from permafrost if we have all the methane thawing out? So people came with like different perspectives. Or I had people coming from, I want to say Samoa, who were interested in like, what is the, like, if we have, like if we are just maintaining our carbon dioxide growth as it is, what is the actual amount of flooding by 2100? So they came with like very specific questions even. So these are some of the higher examples, obviously. A lot of students, a lot of activists, a lot of press people who are, who want to know what do the scientists think, what do the scientists know. So there were different kinds of interactions, like from top to bottom, I'd say.
Really cool, thanks.
I suppose I have a bit of a follow-up question on that, Bimo. I mean, first of all, I guess it's two tiered. Like, first of all, did you have to do some studying before you went? I mean, you are an expert in your field, and so like me, I can answer very specific questions, but only about a small subset of the ocean. But if you have people coming up to you asking about methane and sea level rise, did you have to go and read some IPCC reports and talk to colleagues?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Actually, you kind of caught me there. I am also only an expert in sea ice, and in like my own perspective on sea ice. If you ask me about thickness, I would probably be like, it's thick sometimes. Yeah, so I studied this State of the Cryosphere report, which actually summarizes a lot of the science. So that was what I was using mostly. And I was referring people to different studies wherever I know them, or if people had very specific questions, then I was trying to get their name and being like, okay, I'll follow up with you, or giving my card, being like, write to me, I'll follow up with you. But the questions were generally not that specific that I couldn't answer them. Sometimes they were. So for example, how much methane in acute terms is going to be released from permafrost? I don't know, a lot, a little, like enough to harm the world. That's what I knew. So yeah, it was generally like general I can answer. If it gets too specific, also, so that is the other thing, is that I was one of the early career scientists, but there were others there as well with different expertise. So I was trying to find them and connect them with those ones, or giving my email address.
All right. I also have tons of questions. Luckily, there's, I think now a new one in the chat. So I'm also one of the people that has already seen what is going to be released at about 15 minutes from now on. The short video where you took a tour through the COP. It's a fun thing to watch, by the way. So it's 4 minutes well spent. So how transparent is this? So do you sneak into those rooms, or you officially go into the rooms and just sit there and listen, and you can listen to everything? Are you even allowed to raise your hand or say something, or is this like a specific etiquette that will guide this process? Can you talk or elaborate a bit on that?
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So generally, I think every meeting they kind of put it out front saying like, okay, we'll allow observers, and then countries can, what's the word I'm looking for, kind of disagree with this saying like, okay, we don't want observers in there. So that was the scenario. And generally you were allowed in most of the rooms, but you were given low priority. So you don't actually, if the room is too full, I got kicked out once or twice because the room was too full and they wanted more party members to come in and observers to leave. So that kind of stuff happened. There are meetings which are definitely closed, and later on in the during the conference, a lot of the meetings get more closed because then that's when things get into like, you know, hyperdrive. People are like, okay, let's get this done. And the other thing I did not mention at all so far is a lot of the discussion actually takes place behind the scenes. So in the hallway, you will see people kind of gossiping with each other, and then that kind of later gets translated in the room. They've already discussed it outside. They agree with each other, that kind of thing. One of the people that was working in the Craftsfair Pavilion with me was actually a former negotiator for Switzerland. So he had a lot of insights, and we'd be walking down the hallway together, him and I, and then he would suddenly like catch somebody and like whisper something in their ears. And then this person would later come and be like, oh yeah, you know, we signed this. So it was a lot of behind the scenes stuff also that I couldn't see or I couldn't like be aware of at the moment, but then I later realized. Also, yeah, when there's definitely some stuff that we would not be allowed to see that happens, especially between the heads of state that are more closed doors.
And what would you say would be or was maybe the most touching scenery that you've seen there, or from these actions from the activists or whatever it was? Were there like a few examples that were like really striking that you would like to point us towards?
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say, but like there were people coming in and they actually had like anger or sadness because they are actually feeling these effects right now. You know, there were people, and I keep going back to these examples of low-lying countries, but there were people who are like, we had to move our house already. So they actually had a lot of very deep sadness that kind of touches to you. And even if they're asking questions at the complete wrong moment, they're like, we're talking about permafrost and they're like talking about flooding, but at the same time it's so real and so impactful. So a lot of these personal stories or like people who have actually felt the effects of climate change was very powerful. And in other terms also, kind of, I completely did not touch upon this whole subject of Egypt and this complication of Egypt being such a heavy-handed country, like ruling everything with an iron fist there, not allowing people to be expressing any emotions. If I tried to take a video once of a crowded bus, and like somebody immediately came, took my phone away and deleted it like on the spot. It was like kind of scary. So that was also kind of powerful in a certain way. And then I don't know if people who have been who have like kind of been following this, they all know about the Egyptian government like jailing one journalist and her sister actually being present at COP at the German pavilion, and there was this whole movement around it, and security came and took somebody away. So this kind of like events were very, very intense as well. And another thing that really left me feeling like was this whole big pavilions, big, very fancy pavilions. And these pavilions, by the way, I didn't mention this, but these cost money. Like our little pavilion, Craftsfair Pavilion, it cost like, I don't know, like 35,000, 40,000 to build, because you got to contract people, does not just come out there, right? So the bigger pavilions, they were worth like at least $1 million sometimes. And you had these like giant, massive pavilions from the UAE or Saudi Arabia. That is just an advertisement venue for their countries. And they're just there saying like, UAE, a sustainable nation. And it's just people come together, take photos, and like, you kind of go there being like, what is this whole event about? What is this whole 30,000 people coming into the middle of a desert? They have to ship water from somewhere. And like, you have this like moment of like, what is going on in this world? Where are our priorities? And so anyways, yeah, I think I kind of rambled a little bit here, but I hope I give some idea for your question.
Thank you, Bimo.
Yeah, you got into some of the sort of conditions that this COP was sort of taking place under. So along that line, what were the sort of accommodations that you were in?
We were in a Airbnb that had been, I think, somebody's vacation home or something. It was pretty bare bones, to be honest. This is a resort town, so there's tons of hotels there. But at the same time, there were like 35,000 people flying in, so everything got sold out. Prices were through the roof, and people were canceling people's reservations and then putting this back on Airbnb at 3 times the price. People were paying like 10,000 euros per week. It was crazy. The whole thing was kind of chaotic. Even rich nations were having difficulty affording things. So imagine how bad it is for poorer nations to come here, fly here, and then stay in this like expensive resort town, paying like tens of thousands of dollars per week. So it was kind of chaotic. Luckily, our accommodation was fine. Everything kind of worked out. Like I said, it was pretty bare bones. We were sharing it between sharing like 2-3 rooms between like 6 early career scientists, but it was fine enough for us. Obviously, there's like fancy 5-star resorts in this town. So if you can afford it, you could find something, but prices were like through the roof. So.
And Bimo, you've talked about
Pretty crazy.
Sorry. You've talked about sort of the eye rolling that you have done, but you also had the sort of the children and youth group who were so passionate. Is there anyone like calling all this out? When you're talking about some countries making a big effort to remove some of the language, or sort of trying to sneak in, it's very obvious perhaps to you or to everybody else, sort of wording or changes to the rules. Is there anyone there that's just putting up their hand and saying, we see what you're doing, this is not constructive, and holding them to account? Or is it all just bureaucracy and all just sort of what isn't being said instead?
Yeah, I think it's there's both happening in different ways, because a lot of people were calling them out on Twitter or calling them out on social media, or kind of pointing to the fact later on. I don't think people were very comfortable trying to bring attention to themselves there, because there was a fear that you will get pulled away by the cops and taken away. It's a very heavy-handed situation there. So none of us felt comfortable saying something loud there. And also, I know that I am, small leagues there. Like my words don't have much, so much power to themselves. So I think there are people calling them out, mostly on social media or mostly from outside. Obviously, a lot of people who are not even at COP kind of pointing out the inconsistencies of this whole situation. The idea that these countries, like private jets flying in the middle of into the middle of the desert and trying to create change. I think there's also a little bit of unfair criticism in the sense that people do have to fly places to meet, to make action. But at the same time, do all of those people need to fly there? I don't know. And this is unfair from me because I got to go there and I'm saying like, oh, this kind of things should not happen. That's completely unfair. But at the same time, I think there needs to be a kind of a rethinking process about this whole thing. The next COP, which I didn't mention also, by the way, is happening in Dubai. And Dubai wants 80,000 people to come there. And like, what the, this absolutely does not make sense. And so, yeah, I think there does need to be more rethinking about this whole thing. And to go back to your question, there was also like this thing about the countries actually doing things that are hindering the progress. That is a little harder to call out, I guess, because it's the way bureaucracy works. And also, these are like, how UN meetings go. You cannot say like, you're being mean, you're being stupid. It's more like, our country would like to thank this country for their words, but would like to still continue pushing forward for this word. It's kind of like that kind of lingo, which we're not so comfortable with using. We're more okay with like saying like, that's stupid, don't do that. But anyways, yeah.
Thank you, Bimo, for that. Really happy that we got through all of this until now without the F word. I'm pretty pleased.
I'm trying my best.
One last question. I don't want to bore you guys out there, but I find it so refreshing to get this, insight from somebody that was just there, that is not John Kerry or somebody, but somebody like within our realm. So I read on The Guardian that there was over 630 something lobbyists. And you mentioned the lobbyists being there, right? And it was a rise of like 25% more than the last time. So my last question would just be, so there was a question if the decision makers would listen to the people there and the different pavilions and so on. Do also these lobbyists, they only go there and they have a certain mission because they're paid by I don't know whom to achieve I don't know what, or are they actually interested? Do they also see what's happening? And did you engage with any of them, or can you tell, because you said they have a badge and you can actually tell this is a lobbyist, this is I don't know what.
Yeah, no, you couldn't always tell that they are lobbyists, but they had, a lot of them had badges from like countries, so they blend in among the negotiators. I'm not 100% sure if all of them had a purpose, but I think some of them definitely had a purpose. Some of them were definitely also aware of, the effects of climate change and the seriousness of the situation, but they're at the same time being like, yes, I know this is bad, but this is my job. I want to find out how I can, try to pull out certain things from this, or try to save their industry from the legislation, or be like, try to identify points in the legislation where their industry can kind of crack through the seams. That's kind of what I was talking also about, this gas. There's this like promotion of gas now as a emerging technology. So there was that kind of initiative for sure. A lot of the lobbyists were also there kind of to put a doorstop on further legislation, to kind of identify how a legislation or how an action might hinder their efforts or their industry. So I think there was different interest for sure. And yeah, it was definitely shocking to see so many fossil fuel lobbyists there in presence, but yeah.
I guess that's what it is. Once again, many thanks for being at the COP, getting all these Insta stories out, for providing us with this video that's going live, I think, in a minute from now. So we're just on time. It was a pleasure having you.
Awesome.
I hope maybe to see you again at some point in the future. Best of luck with the defense of the PhD that's upcoming, and
thank you.
Have a great night, you guys out there. Don't put your heads down. We get this done somehow. So spread the word on climate change and needed action. We'll do that. I hope you do that too, and hopefully we see each other next week then at the German-speaking episode of Wissenschaft fürs Wohnzimmer.